The founder of this show said a couple of months ago something along the lines of, oftentimes the first time a couple actually has a negotiation where they're talking about what type of relationship they want, it's at the negotiating table with a mediator as they're going through divorce proceedings. And I have definitely found that to be true as a therapist, particularly around things like monogamy or how to solve a fight or these different things. I'll often ask people, how monogamous are you? And they might be, 5-10 years a couple, and all of a sudden we're starting to realize that their understanding of whether or not it's acceptable to go to a strip club, whether or not it's acceptable to watch pornography or these different things really are different. So how do we have those conversations now rather than after things start to blow up?
Yeah, well, I would love to believe that we're starting to see a little bit more of a culture shift toward conscious relationship,
Mm.
and I think as non-traditional relationships enter into the mainstream and it becomes more of a household, something that's people can acknowledge and speak about, people understand the words non-monogamy or the word
Mhm.
polyamory, as there's fewer and fewer people who are like polyamory, I've never heard of that.
Mhm.
I'm hoping that just the fact that there's an awareness of the spectrum of relationship and the spectrum of choices that would at least start to force some people to start to have those conversations around, well, what am I? What do I like in relationship? Now we kind of actually have to think about it, hopefully. And I think even if you think about it and you still land on, well, monogamy still sounds pretty good. I still feel like that's kind of 10 steps ahead than where we've been for the last, hundreds of years, essentially, where monogamy is this default that we don't think about. Because I think consciously chosen monogamy can be a really awesome, wonderful, life fulfilling thing as well.
Yeah, just the fact that people are aware that there are options feels like a step in the right direction.
Right,
Uh,
exactly.
but how do we, I guess, challenge ourselves and work with our partner to do something with this, like to know that we have options and then to actually pursue them? You know, I.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there's a lot of moving parts to that because I think the first place that we have to come to is a place of being honest with ourselves,
Mhm.
right? Of what it is that we want. And sometimes figuring out what it is that we want can be a confusing thing, an unclear thing, an amorphous thing. But I think it does require kind of that radical honesty with oneself of like, hey, I don't think I'm monogamous, or maybe, hey, I don't think I'm 100%, or hey, I think I'm monogamous, but actually there's, these kind of non-monogamous sexual situations that I think about. And so I think it requires both that honesty with oneself and then kind of having the guts to bring that honesty to one's partner. And a lot of people
Mhm.
really struggle with that. I think a lot of people feel that it's almost like the Schrodinger's box situation where if I open this box, if I even imply to my
Mhm.
partner that maybe I don't want to be monogamous or maybe I'm even open to something other than monogamy, that's going to be the destruction of the relationship. And to be fair, a lot of the models and a lot of the images that we see in media of non-monogamy is still fairly toxic.
Mhm.
For most of us, the examples that we see in media are kind of soap opera-esque dramatic love triangles, or if we see what happened if our parents if our parents ended up having infidelity or stuff like that, like often we see a lot of the toxic effects, and so there is kind of still this culturally held idea of like, ooh, stay away from that topic as far as you possibly can, because even getting close to it is kind of like toxic waste, and if you get it on you, then you're not going to be able to get it off. So I think there's definitely a process of both honesty and then accepting like kind of how scary and unknown this is, and then just kind of being able to take ownership of what it is that you're interested in and what it is that you want. And that's like so freaking scary, regardless of where you are in your relationship, whether you've known this person for 2 weeks or you've been dating for 20 years, it's still really, really scary. And so I do think that often is the biggest hurdle that kind of holds people back from being able to have these conversations, is just that it seems scary and it seems like on the other side of it, all we're looking at is kind of like the relationship falling off a cliff, essentially.
Mhm.
Do
Yeah.
you find, sorry, do you find that more people that you talk to are already in relationships and have to have these conversations with partners, or are you find like what's the balance between the people who are already in monogamous relationships that they've entered into, maybe unconsciously, maybe consciously, and it's changed, versus people who are single and out and looking and kind of have that awareness of themselves?
Yeah, so among my client base anyway, I would say that the majority of the people that I end up working with are people who are coming from a monogamous relationship where they're starting to have these conversations and they're undertaking the opening up process. That being said, I am starting to see more and more and more people who are kind of undertaking that journey of honesty and being like, okay, maybe I just got out of a monogamous relationship and it's clear that that wasn't for me and I'm ready to start dating, but I know that I don't want to just date traditionally. I know that I want to date with an intention towards something non-traditional or something non-monogamous. I'm starting to see more single people or recently unpartnered people who want to carry that intention into their dating and into, their search for a partner or partners. And I will say, sometimes people don't really think about this, but I think the struggle of being someone who's single and kind of taking ownership of this identity and then now holding that intention and starting to date people with it versus the struggle of a couple who's been monogamous for some time and now they're deciding to open up and change their relationship to a non-monogamous one. They're very, very different struggles. Actually, there's
Mhm.
some overlap. There's definitely a little bit of overlap there on the Venn diagram, but I mean, I can say, speaking from my personal experience, I had a much easier time once I finally started just crafting my relationships where from day one, this is non-monogamous, and day one, we're honest about that and we're open about that, versus, the handful of experiences I had of like, let's be monogamous first for 6 months or a year or several years and then open up. That for me, in my personal experience, I found that to be way harder. The
Hmm.
kind of changing the rules, understandably so, like 100% understandably so.
Sure.
Right. That was also my experience. I am currently trying to delve into non-traditional multi-partner type relationships. And it's also from a recent breakup, not very recent, but last year, that ended kind of sort of because of the fact he wanted to open things up. And I feel like I have some questions just about the way you should be approaching that, and maybe this ties into what you're asking as well. I'm assuming sending a text message at the beginning of a weekend where one of the partners is going to be away saying, "I'm going to go on some dates this weekend," is not the best way to
Unideal,
approach that.
generally unideal.
Are you speaking from personal experience or
Possibly.
Too specific to be improvised.
Yeah, I wouldn't recommend that. If that's the first time you're hearing of it, that's probably not gonna go over very well, I would imagine. Well, I have a question, if you don't mind me putting it back on you, if you don't
Mhm.
mind diving into it, in your experience with that particular relationship, to you, what do you think you felt like you would have needed in order for that conversation to go a lot smoother or for that pitch essentially to go over better?
That's a good question. I think ultimately I needed a little bit of time to make a decision and to actually be acclimated to it. I also think that being willing to do the research and read the books
Sure.
and make the calendars and all of that was would have helped me be more confident that we were both coming at it from the same place. Because once I found out that that's what he wanted to do, I was like, okay, I don't really know if I want to do this, but I'll do the research. I'll ask my friends who are in poly relationships and do all this. And every time I would bring something to him, he'd be like, oh, we can just wing it. It's fine.
Hmm.
And wasn't willing to do that extra work. So I think, yeah, just being open to learning about it together and being open to doing that work as a couple would have helped a lot.
Yeah, well, and that type of intentionality is really what I kind of wanted to highlight tonight, and what I feel is lacking in so many relationships is just having those conversations, the willingness to read a damn book.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, how empty would my therapy practice be if more people were willing to just pick up a book to just try, honestly? And I don't mean to make it seem as if these things are easy or that people are lazy. Certainly that can be true. But I feel like we have this notion of relationships as they're supposed to be easy if they're right. They're supposed to be beautiful and perfect if things are going correctly. And it's a little bit of a surprise when things get a little bit wobbly and you have to put effort and some intentionality and forethought into these things.
Right.
Yeah, and I wanted to highlight what you brought up, V, that even in non-monogamous relationships and polyamorous relationships, you can still fall victim to mismatched assumptions
Mhm.
about what it's going to be, because that's the kind of thing now is, even though it's great, at least in my experience, even though it's great that I see more people on dating sites, being open about the fact that they're ethically non-monogamous or in an open relationship or polyamorous, at the end of the day, that doesn't mean shit, because it's like you still need to get into a 2-hour conversation about like, okay, what does that actually mean to you?
Right.
Mhm.
How do you practice that? The same conversations that we should be having about monogamy. When you say you
Yeah.
want monogamy, what does that feel like to you? What does that look like to you? How are we going to communicate about that? Things like that. Yeah, and then the intentionality bit that you mentioned is, it's interesting because there is kind of this like pendulum swing between the camp of, well, we can just wing it,
Mhm.
and too much intentionality is going to stifle the romance, and all the sex and everything needs to be organic and spontaneous, which is like, I suppose theoretically the more romantic end of the spectrum, and yet can also have some issues of its own. And then kind of on the other end of the spectrum is the idea of like, well, we have to have everything planned out. Specifically, we have to know exactly what it is that we want. We need to kind of get
Mhm.
everything down to a T, which also kind of has some of its own problems as well.